what he's talking about with the Eucatastrophe is that is a very harsh reality that many of us, all of us, are now physically undergoing in the pandemic, and that is that there is a moment in the journey, in the fairy tale journey, in the hero's journey, where the hero, the heroine, has to die. And sometimes that death is physical. In the Russian fairy tales, it's quite frequent that the prince Ivan gets chopped into pieces, and very often by his own brothers, which is not accidental. Mm-hmm. And it would seem that that was the end of the story. But there is always a sudden joyous turn, mm-hmm. which is the Eucatastrophe, that necessitates the presence of outside forces that do not in any way act as a deus ex machina, but rather that provide that overlaying across reality that suggests that it matters that you have this failure, because it's not simply a light being snuffed out in the darkness, but it is a personal death that is reflective of cosmic death that has to end in the destruction of death. Mm-hmm. That is the Eucatastrophe.
Welcome to Manifesto's YouTube channel.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor.
Great. Well, it's an honor having you on here as well. I'll give you a little short introduction. You're a writer of epic fantasy inspired by Russian fairy tales. You're the conductor of a men's choir at a Russian monastery, and you're also a Grammy-nominated vocalist.
Yes.
And I think I've got to know you the most so far from the podcast that you host, which is In a Certain Kingdom, where I call them, we just spoke about really well-crafted Slavic fairy tales, which has actually inspired me to change a little bit the way I work, of bringing in storytelling and kind of like talking about stories and folk tales in Manifesto and the work that we're doing as well. So that's been, thank you very much for that.
Well, I'm glad you're doing that. That's exactly the direction everybody should be going. Tell him that.
Yeah, exactly. So the first time I came across your name, it was this article that you'd written on the Symbolic World website or blog called "Why Fairy Tales Might Be Better Than a Vaccine." Yes. And that's quite a curious, good heading, or it pikes one's curiosity. So can you explain for people who don't know you, what's that about, and what do you mean by fairy tales and a vaccine? How can those two things be connected?
I mean, okay, well, it was written, before the vaccine was even a possibility, and it was more the idea of this cure-all coming from a place of hard materialism, and my reaction to the very idea of there being a kind of salvation from science. Which seems to be the way that everything has been presented, especially since the beginning of the pandemic. And not trying to belabor any points about the politics of the thing, but it really struck me from the very beginning how much the coming of the pandemic sort of tore aside the skin deep veneer that we've all been surviving with about how we view the world, how everybody views the world, and it's left people with no ability to hide their actual interaction with reality. Mm-hmm. And for what I was shocked by is how many people who profess themselves either non-religious or religious, it doesn't matter where they found themselves on the spectrum, ended up having worldviews that very often jarred quite significantly with what they pretended to be. Mm-hmm. So the kind of lives that they seem to be leading, at least on the surface, did not accord with what they were now saying as soon as the pandemic happened. So suddenly there was this strange disconnect in how they spoke about reality and how they lived it. Mm-hmm. And I found that to be fascinating. I found that to be quite disturbing, naturally, especially because many people that I thought would react in a certain way ended up reacting in the exact opposite way. And other people who I was sure would react in a way that would be antithetical to me, people that I normally would never agree with, suddenly ended up saying things that I found to be very compelling. Mm-hmm. And so the concept here, of course, was just was a clickbait article title, so that more people would.
But can I get you to be a little bit more specific? Like when you say that people react in a different way, and you mentioned this thing with like hard materialism, what exactly?
the idea that I find astounding is that the thing that first got me to pay attention is that people that would consider themselves to be religious in worldview suddenly started to act as if they didn't believe in the hard realities of what that religious worldview requires of them. And maybe I'm speaking that a little too harshly. I mean, the word require is a difficult one, especially nowadays. But what I mean is that if you have a certain way of viewing the world, your actions should reflect that belief. Your worldview should accord with the way you lead your life. And if we want to get very specific about it, what it meant is that if you are a Christian, if you're a Christian of a certain stripe, you don't go into the ritual aspect of your faith thinking it's window dressing or something that's merely there to pass the time or something that's merely there to make you feel good about things that otherwise might be too abstruse or too difficult to understand. No, the traditional way that these people would have expressed their faith was that these rituals reflect the reality that I live. They are actual. They are not merely symbolic. And this is an interesting point, by the way, the thing about symbolism. I'm going on a slight rabbit hole, but I think it's relevant, is that I was taking a class with a writer of some very beautiful poetry and both fiction and nonfiction recently. And I raised the question about whether or not symbolism and image are the same thing in writing, especially writing poetry. Is the image, because his claim was that image is something that is primal. It's something that happens before language. It's something that happens on the level of instinct, on the level of bare bones reality. On the reality that is not made in some sense arbitrary or in some sense mediated by the existence of language. And I suggested to him, what about the symbol? Is that another way of interpreting the image? Is that another way of looking at the image? And he said, well, symbolism is a construct. Symbolism is something that is placed on top of reality by the writer himself. So it's not the same as the image. And then I countered and I said, well, could it not be that symbolism is not something that is arbitrarily constructed by the crafter, by the writer, by the person speaking language, but could not symbol be something that is intrinsic to reality? And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about these rituals and about worldview connecting with action. It's that what I saw is that people who profess to be Christian preferred to stay in the safety of their own home because they believed that being at home, isolated, would be better for them ultimately than going into a public place of worship where they, as they say they believe, partake of not a symbol, but the actual body and blood of Christ, which they say through the prayers that they speak is a better inoculation against disease than any apparent safety behind four walls. And so when I started to read articles even by priests who were openly saying that they had not gone to communion for 6 months, I started to think, what is going on here? Because if a priest doesn't commune, technically speaking, he's no longer even a Christian, much less a priest. And what I'm talking about here is canon law. I mean, these are things that the church has grappled with for a long time and has come to a decision through consensus that these things are not something that one chooses to do. These rituals are not things that we arbitrarily layer on top of our reality to make ourselves feel a certain way. That's the way Christianity has always approached it. So when I'm talking about fairy tales and vaccines, what I'm talking about is essentially worldview. And a vaccine is not going to fix your worldview. A vaccine may inoculate you against the disease. It may even protect you from death. But that life that you lead that requires a magical remedy, effectively, is not going to be a particularly meaningful or a particularly deep existence, because there is going to be another something that comes around the corner that is going to require another magical remedy. So why then am I even offering the magical reality of fairy tales? It would seem to be strange, except that fairy tales are actually all about reality. They're not about magic. They're all about hard, everyday, earthy reality, about rocks, about stones, about wood, about interpersonal relationships, about love, about things like that.
Mm-hmm. Or even the very fabric of reality was the word you used. Yeah. So this makes me think of, so our kind of point of connection, if we look at it, is Jordan Peterson, right? That's I guess how we got to talk together. I think he's been a gathering point for a lot of interesting people. And both of us watched the interview with Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau recently, where for me, the core topic of their conversation was what they called the meeting point, or the touching of narrative reality and material reality. And how what you're pointing to here is that as a Christian, there's actually a fundamental belief that those things are intimately connected, to the extent that you can actually base your life on it, and every single decision can be based on that. And one of the things that I really appreciate Jordan Peterson for, and this also comes from, so just a couple of days ago, I was talking to a journalist here in Denmark who's an atheist, but she said what she sees from Jordan Peterson is a pointing to the hypocrisy of Christianity in current society, in where it's become like a kind of self-substantiating system that looks after its own self, but it doesn't seem to have any real depth in application to it as well. And it seems to me you're agreeing with that.
Well, it's interesting that she should say that, and I think it's unfortunate that people should take that point as a takeaway point from the interview, if that's what happened, in fact, because it seemed to me that Jordan's cry of the heart about this hypocrisy of the church was very much a profound agony for the reality that he feels must be there in Christianity that is not reflected in the actions of its proponents. And that's something that is not, it's not something that one should shy away from. And I think it's an unfortunate reality that so many public Christian people do tend to shy away from that sort of thing. But returning back to the worldview of the fairy tale, it's messy. It's filled with contradiction. It's filled with people doing very stupid things, and it's filled with violence, and it's filled with unpleasant realities. These fairy tales are, and I much prefer leaning into that and seeing what comes out when you really delve into the reality of that paradox, because I think it's a very strange and very modern, maybe even postmodern. I think it's a modern thing to expect there to be some sort of harmonizable vision of this world that will make you perfectly content and okay with everything, because the world is an awful place, and I don't think any of the Christianity ever pretended to suggest that heaven on earth was possible, at least not in this age.
So what is the role of science then, Nicholas? Like where do you see that in this whole construction, or from where you're standing and seeing the world?
It's interesting. I'm going to answer this question in a tangential way, because I don't know myself the exact answer, and I'll see if I can find it as I speak. I'm writing a piece right now. It's a libretto for a full-length classical music oratorio, and the idea of it is a kind of exploration of a new myth for America through history, through fairy tale, through music. And the way that I approached it with my co-creator, who's writing the music of it, the actual composer, is looking at a nearly distant future where there's a kind of utopia that comes about in America that is a melding of, or a combination of the sciences as they exist now, with a kind of mysticism that is shorn of all of the difficulty that has to do with internal transformation. So a kind of temple to Sophia, where the priests are also scientists. I think this is something that the Postmodern Project would like to see happen. A kind of temple to science, because if you look at the way many of the new atheists speak about science, they speak about it with a religious fervor. That's not by accident. So where then is the proper harmonizable vision of science as a experience of practical realities, with the undeniable spiritual reality that all of us occasionally come upon and sometimes plunge deep into. I think there must be a place for proper science of the observable kind, of the kind that Darwin was a proponent of, which means in a certain sense a kind of presence, a kind of opening your eyes to the realities as they present themselves to you. The problem is when you put that sort of approach on the level of prophecy, which is what it's trying to do, on the level of poetry, on the level of philosophy, which it's not, it doesn't seem to me to have the proper apparatus to be able to pontificate on issues of on issues beyond its competency. If science is supposed to talk about observable phenomena, then let it do that. At the same time, if you look at scientists that study things like dark matter, things that are not really observable at all, but are a definite reality, you also see them going into a kind of philosophical, pseudo-religious view of what it is that they look at, because they realize quite truly that the simple organs of sense that we have are not nearly enough to be able to make any sort of definitive proclamation about the nature of reality. You can't. All you can do is say what you see. And oftentimes it's through the mediation of instruments that you make yourself. So how can you then even pretend to think that the things that you see through the things that you made are going to give you ultimate pronouncements about things that are beyond what you are? It seems to me a fool's errand. And I think that science is coming around to it too. I think many scientists are understanding this.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to see where it goes.
Yeah. Well, certainly we've seen a lot of people who have come to a realization that, you know, we need alternative frameworks to understand reality. And one of the guys I've been speaking a lot to recently, his name's Kettle Lost. I think he's an anthropologist, and he's been a kind of also a Dawkins Hitchens atheist, a new atheist. But then in his studies, as he kind of dug further and further back in time, and he encountered this concept of God, and then he started like trying to have conversations with his fellow scientists about it, and he just like, he's kind of got excluded from company as soon as he tried to do this. So he ended up basically going renegade, and now he's written a book called Sex, God, and Masculinity, which kind of take the three most controversial topics he could find.
Taboo, yes.
But yeah, taboo topics he could find, and has found through that like a connection, a reconnection to depth of existence somehow. And it's almost like, yeah, I think what we're seeing is, you know, there's a realization that, well, we obviously can't explain, you know, the most central thing, which is the human mind, or, you know, that which perceives the world through, you know, there's no direct connection between the brain and consciousness. It seems like, and so,
no matter what the Google tech people tell you about your mind being, you know, software and things like this.
Well, I mean, and then, you know, if you go deep enough, they don't believe that. They know that that's not the case, right? But then there's still this transhumanist. Then it just becomes spiritual, as you say.
Oh, very much so. Oh, yeah.
So that's interesting. But yeah, so I've seen on your website, you're working with things like resilience and mentorship and kind of helping people to do that. And so, yeah, what has been some of your, well, maybe I can actually ask you, you know, like if we talk about this realization that Jordan Peterson was sitting with about like the touching of material and narrative reality. And that's something that Jordan Peterson is kind of like standing right on the border of and not stepping over into.
Right.
And so I think for a lot of us who are schooled and trained in Western thought, then it seems, you know, it's kind of like weird or freakish to step over that boundary in some ways. But maybe you can say, like, you know, what was it that gives you the.
No, it's a really important point. And by the way, I will apologize if there are sounds of screaming babies coming through. this is
like no screaming babies.
Very earthy, really.
As long as they're not suffering any harm, then we'll.
No. It's not. No, it's fine. But just if that happens, this is the reality here. So, it's interesting. It's interesting that people like Jordan Peterson still have this resistance to narrative reality impinging on actual physical reality, because there's a lot of very interesting scientific research, especially in neurobiology, that shows that there is a very definite link between stories, the way people interpret them, and the actual sort of physical structure of the brain. Now, I'm not a scientist at all, but I've read enough about this to pique my interest, and because what the scientists are suggesting in this particular field is that story is actually the way that we interpret reality. Storytelling is the most basic and the most fundamental way that humanity has of not merely making sense of an existing reality, but of actually making reality, insofar as they are able to make it, insofar as they are separate from the physical reality of things around them. So much so that there's a really interesting study done on students' brains, and I think it's significant that it was students, and that they were sort of young, and neuroplasticity is still sort of a possibility at a certain age, and maybe not so much at a later age. But the basics of it is that they were given their brain activity was tested in an MRI machine before, during, and after the process of reading a otherwise insignificant sort of plot forward thriller about Pompeii. So it wasn't a particularly meaningful piece of literature, and it wasn't supposed to be, because it was supposed to be easy to read and easy to kind of understand and kind of just get the brain processing reading on an easy level. And they found that the brain continued to read for 5 days after it finished. So there's something about the actual process of reading that impinges on the mind. And in certain other books that have explored this this phenomenon, things like The Shallows by Nicholas Carr, which is a wonderful book, highly recommended. There are some suggestions in the science that the brain actually changes its shape based on how much you read and what you read and what medium you read in. All that to say that there is something in connection. There's a very strong connection between reading, story, and reality that humanity has always known about, because we've always had stories. And there's a very interesting connection in terms of the kinds of stories different cultures tell. Sometimes there's very bizarre interweavings of theme and of image and of motif that we can talk about more if you want. But all that to say that there is that narrative reality is not simply something that people made up in order to overlay across natural reality. There's something about just the very biology of the human being that reacts to and is changed by interaction with story, which suggests that story is a fundamental reality, that storytelling is a reality that you can actually measure, not simply talk about in a more abstract way, which I think is fascinating, because we've always known that story has a reality in the realm of ideas, in the realm of kind of the abstracted, but that stories have, that storytelling, that narrative has a reality that impinges on the physical, is something that we can actually see.
Yeah. Well, one thing I thought was interesting is exploring or understanding better or getting your opinion on is, I've been listening to your stories, and they're Russian stories. And I grew up in South Africa and I've been living in Denmark for 18 years. I actually just read a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale the other day after listening to one of your podcasts. It's called The Tinderbox. I don't know if you know it. It's a very dark story. I was shocked actually I was like, wow, we're giving this to children, because it's basically like this soldier who, murders and cheats his way to becoming the king. And I
do know that story. There's a Russian version of that story. I know that story very well. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I could certainly feel what you're talking about. Is like, I was kind of like a little bit shaken by this story, and it's been working on me for days afterwards. And especially knowing like, okay, well, this story is actually, it was the first book in a big compilation of Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales.
So
Yeah,
how do we deal with the darkness in stories, and what does that have to do with raising our children? Is that the question?
yeah, and especially, well, yeah, and it started off with, I mean, what I was really going at is also like, you know, stories from our own cultural heritage as well, and
Yeah.
like how are we formed by as, and you know, are they universal? Are they different? You know,
Yeah, I used to say quite definitively that that sort of the universal aspect of storytelling is something that one must pay a lot of attention to, and that's there certainly are a lot of shared themes throughout cultures. There are certain shared structures. There's an argument to be made that the kind of a version of the hero's journey is something that appears pretty much in all cultures. And I get that thought and that idea primarily from Tolkien's largely not scientific thoughts on the nature of fairy tales in his essay on fairy tales, or on fairy stories rather. Recently, I've come against a lot of resistance to this idea, partially from professional folklorists who have been taught and trained by what is obviously a postmodern approach to the world, that any sort of unification of storytelling traditions tends to other marginalized cultures and populations. Now, I don't like that kind of narrative. I think that narrative has a very strong and very destructive power. And I come from a tradition and from a way of thinking that tends to do both justice to the difference and acknowledgement of the possibility of the together. That's at heart what Christianity tries and in some cases manages to do. So all that to say that I believe that that the fact of story in all cultures is indisputable. So each one of us is going to be formed by them in slightly different ways, but all of them do a great deal in terms of the moral foundation of children, and particularly because of the darkness. I think it was Chesterton who said that children don't need to know that dragons don't exist. They know they exist. They just need to know how to defeat them. And that's, I mean, and I'm paraphrasing, that's not his exact quote, but that's absolutely true. Dragons do exist. And I'm not talking about the scaly things with, wings, I'm talking about the reality of the dragon as a force of chaos, as a force of destruction that can appear in the human heart, in your own heart. And you have to know how to destroy that. And whitewashing or removing the darkness or making it somehow more palatable for children is something that adults do for their own sake, because they think that they are damaging their children, and they're not. There's something about the child's mind that accepts the reality of the dark, the difficult, the violent as something that is intrinsic to reality. But the important thing is not the presence of it. This isn't a wallowing in darkness. The importance is the journey through it and out of it to what Tolkien calls the Eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn at the end, where you realize that the evil within you and outside of you can and must be defeated. So,
but that's like a tendency that, I don't know. So this tinderbox story that I mentioned from Hans Christian Andersen, like, that's not the case. There's no Eucatastrophe at all, right? And
true,
and when you talk about dragons, dragons these days, they're cute, cozy little things that are really nice and playful and good, and they're just misunderstood, right?
So well, I have a real problem. I have a real problem with that. I think the how to train your dragon phase is something that's already on its way out, and I think it's going to go away soon. I don't know how well that latest Disney movie is doing, but I don't think that it's going to be one of the great successes of Disney animation, because, and partially at least because the dragon is a cute thing, and because I think that humanity understands that dragons are not cute, and at the very least, they are. They might not be evil in some traditions. They might be wise and distant and kind of ancient. I like Ursula Le Guin's version of dragons in her Earthsea series. They are extremely perilous. They might have some good to them, but you certainly don't want to get on the wrong side of one. And one of them might just eat you at any point just because he's a dragon. So I mean, I'm annoyed by the cutification of the dangerous. but I don't think it has a hold on culture, and I don't think children believe it. I think they like the plush animals, but ultimately it's not Toothless that is going to be the avatar of this generation. It's going to be Baby Yoda. And there's a reason for that, because Baby Yoda is not a dragon, and he's cute. So the cutification of Baby Yoda is one thing. The cutification of the dragon is another. And notice how that kind of cute dragon thing, it had its moment. It's passing. And we're once again ready to encounter dragons as they are in Game of Thrones, as they are in The Witcher, as they are in traditional stories, a dangerous force that you don't want to come too close to. But getting back to the Hans Christian Andersen story, it's certainly a tale of morality. I don't think it's one of those fairy tales that I don't think it's one of those fairy tales that is as instrumental in forming the consciousness as some of the other ones are. It's a 19th century tale. It doesn't come from a very distant past. And the whole genre of soldier of fortune, finding his gold, his woman or whatever, is a for me a genre that I don't particularly like. So this is not to say that all fairy tales without qualification are good and must be embraced wholly. No, of course not. There are some fairy tales that are quite bad, and that's fine. You can't expect everything that comes from any genre to be perfect or to be ideal simply because the genre is old.
One of the questions I wrote down is you write on your website that you write for readers who love classic fantasy like Lord of the Rings, but who aren't afraid of a little darkness and honesty about the human condition.
Yeah.
Why did you write that, and what did you mean by that, and how does that come to expression in your work?
Well, the reality is that a lot of people who grew up with Lord of the Rings and Narnia, the ones that are in my camp, the ones that loved those things for the deep, I hesitate to say archetypal because it already has so much connotation to it, but for those aspects of it that go all the way back to heroic romance, to epic, to the things that form civilization in so many different places in so many different ways. What ended up happening was there was a bifurcation and this is getting a little bit technical, I apologize, but there was a kind of split in the book world where those people who read fantasy but who liked the surface elements of it, dragons, elves, dwarves, and things like this, started to prefer those aspects. So there was the whole literature that arose that focused on that, but very often to the detriment of the deeper reality of it. And I'm particularly thinking of unfortunately, the Sword of Shannara, which I think is the father of modern fantasy, not Lord of the Rings. Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara has, in a lot of ways is very similar to Lord of the Rings in its structure and in the way that the story happens. But the Eucatastrophe at the end is an entirely different one. It has nothing to do with the star shining through the darkness in the sky of Mordor and the suggestion that there is, after all, a reality of the Valar beyond all of this, and that this our small tragedy is simply a tragedy that will pass, and all that is good and beautiful and poetry and beauty will continue no matter what happens here. That's not what happens in Terry Brooks and in a lot of the modern fantasy. You have this kind of accessing of inner divinity or something, this realization of something within yourself that already exists, and all you have to do is unleash it. Now, it's been a long time since I've read Sword of Shannara, so I could be getting it slightly wrong, but that was certainly my impression of it when I read it. I thought, I'm being sold fool's gold. And so what ended up happening is the fantasy went in that direction, and that direction was not one that grappled deeply with epic topics. And the reaction in the other camp was Christian fiction, which is a sort of denuding of in a lot of ways, of difficult reality in order to preach to the choir that all you need is a kind of, and sometimes literally, right? All you need is a kind of correct series of beliefs, and all the evil straw men that come in your way will simply fall at the appropriate moment, and you will not have any temptations or difficulties. And at the end, there will be a choir in heaven that sings hallelujah as you get what you always wanted, which is just another version of the Terry Brooks thing, just with religious trappings. So I found that what people really like about Lord of the Rings is not the external things. It's not the elves, it's the grappling with dark reality. It's the grappling with the line in the middle of the human heart, as Solzhenitsyn would have it. And that is a dark place, because every human being has that line. And if you look at the dark side of that line, there are some really horrible dragons curling themselves around in that place. And I think we've forgotten about that. Both sides have. All sides have. So that's what I want to do with my stories, is not glorify the darkness, because that is definitely something that is popular. That is definitely what Game of Thrones is doing. But rather address it as a reality and show, like the fairy tales do, that it is a reality that is not ascendant. It is a reality that is temporary. It is a reality that must and will fade and pass and die. And that you have a part to play in that.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing, because I mean, I can, my own life has kind of traced these lines in some ways. I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings when I was young, and was just like, I still remember the images in my mind as I was reading those. Like, it was very, very deep and impactful.
Yeah.
And then from there, I went and read Terry Brooks. And then I can remember also, like, sometimes getting introduced to some Christian literature, because I grew up in a Christian home, and finding it just boring and one-dimensional and plain. And the complexity of existence was kind of removed from it. And so maybe my question is, maybe you can talk a little bit more about this word, the Eucatastrophe, that comes from Tolkien, I understand. And how is that connected to this, what do you say, the dragons that curl around the human heart, or whatever it is? Like,
when he's talking about the Eucatastrophe, he's talking specifically about a point in the heroic journey of every true fairy tale. And he has it in a very specific context, which we can talk about, because he believes that the fairy tale structure, the 3-act structure that Aristotle talks about, which is reflected in fairy tales and in all the great literature, is actually made historical and made real in the life of Christ. But what he's talking about with the Eucatastrophe is that is a very harsh reality that many of us, all of us, are now physically undergoing in the pandemic, and that is that there is a moment in the journey, in the fairy tale journey, in the hero's journey, where the hero, the heroine, has to die. And sometimes that death is physical. In the Russian fairy tales, it's quite frequent that the prince Ivan gets chopped into pieces, and very often by his own brothers, which is not accidental. And it would seem that was the end of the story. But there is always a sudden joyous turn, which is the Eucatastrophe, that necessitates the presence of outside forces that do not in any way act as a deus ex machina, but rather that provide that overlaying across reality that suggests that it matters that you have this failure, because it's not simply a light being snuffed out in the darkness, but it is a personal death that is reflective of cosmic death that has to end in the destruction of death. That is the Eucatastrophe. And that is something that, as Jonathan made the point repeatedly to Jordan Jordan Peterson in that interview, is that something that is only actually ever spoken in storytelling form by the Christians. Nobody has ever attempted to tell a story about destroying death by death. It's only hinted at in the fairy tales, and it only comes into fruition in the fairy tale tradition in cultures that have embraced Christianity. And so in the Russian setting, fairy tales are a very interesting thing, because they are very much set in a pagan world, or many of them are. I'm not talking about the ones where not the Soldier of Fortune ones, which are very clearly a 19th century historical setting, but the old ones, the ones that have Baba Yaga and Koschei the Deathless and these kinds of archetypal characters. They exist in a world that is clearly has its roots in a pre-Christian reality. And very often they don't have any reference to a Christian reality at all, except insofar as the resolution of those fairy tales is something that is not possible in the pagan worldview. Because if it's true that Odin sacrificed himself, but it's not the same as Christ trampling down death by death. That's a different story. It's similar. There's a lot of echoes in the structure of it and in some of the details of it. But the Eucatastrophe is something that is only possible after a certain historical moment. And that is something that the literature of the nihilist, like Game of Thrones and like much of modern fantasy, fails to grapple with, and tries to instead insist on the possibility of there being a reality that is not only agnostic to whether or not you exist, but almost antagonistic to you as a living thing.
So what I'm getting out of that is like this Eucatastrophe. It is when that exists in a story, then that means that there's an element in the story which, as a listener, seeing myself as, you know, the hero in my own life, I can develop an insight into a tradition or an association with a tradition whereby the hero steps out over the abyss and risks the total annihilation by the forces of evil in order to transform, you know, kind of flip reality into you know, faith in that belief that can happen at least, and in that being the right thing to do. And so, and I'm wondering, like, is this something that, so, you know, the majority of people who listen to this channel are not Christians. So I'm just curious, is this something that you think can be transmitted through stories? Is it reliant on one being a Christian as well?
No, not at all. I don't think so. No, I don't think so, because I think it, and this was Tolkien's point, is that it's a reflection of reality as it is, not a reflection of reality as a Christian would prefer it to be. These stories are what they are, and they have been told for thousands of years in differing forms, but ultimately culminating in the form that they are given to us. And the form that they are given to us is one that is, at least on the surface, not Christian. These Russian fairy tales that I retell, only a few of them have any explicit reference to Christian realities in Russia. Most of them
but for example, like I can just mention, like the was it Ivan and the Grey Wolf, where he right at the end, he's like got the girl, he's got the horse, he's got the whole thing, and then he gets like meets with the brothers, and brothers annihilate him and kill him, and then so there's an echo of that idea of like through death, then actually victory happens, which is reflected, and again, that's a part of like, you know, like I think in the Christianity that I grew up in, then there was a rejection of that idea that anything could in any way mirror Christianity, because that would somehow reduce Christianity. But the way I'm understanding is that this is just seen, well, no, Christianity is just, you know, it's the most clear image we have of a pattern of reality that's echoed and repeated in all things, you know. So when you say like Odin was also crucified on a tree, then that's something that reinforces this pattern as being a fundamental part of existence. Which
that's how I see it, and that's the way that makes most sense to me. And there are plenty of people who would disagree and would say that these are all historical accidents, and that they all are influencing each other in various ways, and all it is a gradual progression from one version of history to another, which is something that I find very difficult to harmonize. The more I read and the more I encounter reality, as far back as we can, you know, if you get to the storytelling traditions that go way back, or if you encounter people in indigenous traditions who have not had, you know, this sort of negative influence of Western civilization, as we must say it is, right? You still find deep archetypal themes that have to do with the grappling of the spiritual with the real, that have to do with the encounter with death, that have to do with transcending danger by submitting to it, with no expectation of there being rainbows and unicorns on the other side. You submit. But this is, and I think there's something very profound about this, and I think it does resonate with people of all stripes, because it is a reflection of their own daily reality. How often do we go through that personal valley of the shadow of death when we think there's no way I can get through this? And the more we battle it, the further deep we get. And this, the moment that we say, not in depression, not in the sense of I abandon and let I'm just going to kill myself, which is the ultimate act so often of rebellion, right? Or disease. No, the submission at the point where you say, I cannot fight this. This must be, because it is. And that's the moment where suddenly things fix themselves. They come back into harmony with no reference to your direct action. This is something I think that everybody understands. If there's anybody who has lived any sort of life, and it's definitely what's happening in the pandemic. I don't think that the narrative that is being sold by the media is one that's particularly compelling to a lot of people. And I think we're seeing that, even in something as banal as the resistance to the vaccine. And I'm not taking any position here. My point being that there is a narrative that's being peddled, and that narrative is science will save you. And it will not simply save your life, it will save you, the thing that you are. And that is patently false. Because even if you get inoculated against every single possible disease that mankind has ever experienced or will ever experience, you will still not inoculate yourself against that line in the heart. And that's the reality that the fairy tales talk about, is that there will be a point where your brother will chop you into pieces.
Yeah.
And unless you have made the pact with the wolf, unless you have had the encounter in the depth of the forest, you're not coming back.
Great. So a lot of big ideas here. If we had to bring it down to concretely, what do we do if we've had this realization that, okay, well, vaccines aren't going to save my life. There's something about the stories and narrative and connecting more to that. What steps can one take to kind of to make this more of a reality, or if one is inspired in a practical way in our life, especially in this time now when we're sitting at home and a lot of normal life is disrupted?
Yeah, it's something that I grappled with in the series that you briefly mentioned that I did on YouTube, the resilience and courage through stories. So I encourage your viewers and listeners to look at that, where I kind of get a little bit more concrete about how you can do that. But basically, the way I've had it explained by various people, and the way I approach it now, is that I think this moment, if we are being given a moment like no other, this is a generational moment, and if we don't take this moment to start living a deep life, we never will. And in fact, if we don't do it now, as soon as we get past the hump, there's going to be the roaring 20s are going to come back. There's going to be a rise in hedonism. There's going to be a rise in me first culture. It's already going in that direction. That's completely antithetical to any sort of deep life. Anybody who lives that life will know that leads nowhere except a very dark place. So if it only means that you simply stop and make time every single day to access your spiritual reality, in the sense of learn about some sort of religious or philosophical tradition, read the ancients, read Aristotle, read Plato, read the ancient Hindu text if you want. Read the ancient books. Spend time doing that. Every day, set aside time for solitude in which you grapple with your own thoughts. And this is not meditation. This is not emptying yourself. This is you choosing some thorny problem that you have, whether it's intellectual or part of your life, set aside time. And you can do it by being still physically or by walking. I prefer walking. And don't let your mind be distracted by anything other than the problem at hand. And you will find something very interesting happen, is that if you start to rein your mind in to the problem, it's very interesting synthesis will happen. You will start having ideas about how to fix the problems that you have simply by moving and by focusing on that problem. Whether or not you pray, by the way. And those of you who are Christian, of course, I say, you interweave that with prayer. And then start exploring the literary traditions that have led us to where we are now. And that starts with the fairy tales. but that also means read classic literature, read 19th century English literature, read Dostoevsky, read the classics of Western civilization, and branch out, read classics of other civilizations too. There's nothing wrong with that. Set aside time every day for the life of the mind, for the life of the spirit, and also for the life of the body. Make sure you're physically active. Make sure you're doing something to push yourself physically. For myself, this means, and I am very much a man of the mind, and for myself, that has meant almost extreme dedication to a training regimen for a race that I hopefully will undertake in the near future. That involves 2 to 3 hours of physical activity a day.
What race are you going to do?
Well, I've been intrigued by adventure racing, which is a kind of a strange mashup of different kinds of sports, but I like the natural element of it because it involves navigation in wilderness and kind of trail running and riding your bike through forests, things like this. So COVID is making things slightly complicated, but hopefully when things
okay. Are you going to do it in a team or is it a solo thing?
In a team, yeah.
In a team,
great. It's a team sport, yeah.
I haven't done one myself, but it certainly looks like a great way of getting out there and nature and body and everything like that.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and appreciate the thoughts of spending time grappling with one's thoughts. We have a program called Manifesto Core where we help guys to develop more clarity about what they want to do with themselves and to reconnect to the passion in their lives, right? A lot of men are very successful with what they thought would make them happy. But as you mentioned, the cultures, it's all the material things. So we're focused on just, getting more stuff and some things get forgotten there. And so I think that's a large part of the people who come to Manifesto is they realize, well, there's something else. And they realize like, well, part of it's in fellowship with other people where we have honest, direct, straight conversations. That's good. But the first thing we get guys to do after they kind of understand like our code of conduct and the way that we work together is just like, what's the one thing that you could be doing in your life that could be moving you in a positive direction? Just find one thing. It doesn't have to be the biggest thing or the most difficult thing, but just like one thing, and then sit with that and write a goal down about it, and then tell it to some other people and make a plan for what you're going to do about it, and keep coming back to it over a period of time. And normally what happens is that one thing expands to, like suddenly you realize like, wow, everything in my life sits together in some way and influences everything else as well.
There's a harmony to it all.
There's a harmony to it, and it connects to a narrative which is connected to the narrative of everybody else in existence as well. And we discover that so many guys that come to our events and they're like, wow, I thought I was the only guy who had these problems, and I realized like everybody else has the exact same problems, and I thought it was just me.
Literally every single person. Yes.
yeah. So maybe that's part of why we need stories, so we can learn.
Oh, absolutely, and because it takes us outside of ourselves, because you can't. You can grapple with your thoughts ad infinitum, but if you don't have access to a deep tradition of thinking, a deep tradition of narrative reality being spoken over and over again through the centuries, you might hit a wall because there's only so much you can do by yourself. But if you are a living member of the community of humanity in its clearest form, which is its storytelling traditions, then you can't go wrong.
Good. Okay. Last thing I'm going to ask you about, Nicholas, we're going to draw to an end now, but I want to ask you about your singing, because I'm a bad singer. I grew up singing in a Protestant church, out of key, next to my dad who also sang out of key while my mother was playing the piano. But I love when I get to sing together with other men. I'd love to just hear from you, like, what is it that you get out of that? Just what's your experience of it? Yeah,
I will tell you first of all that there's no such thing as an out of tune person. And my wife, who is a professional musician, who's finished conservatory and is a teacher of music as a profession, is the first thing she tells everyone. So no matter how bad you think you are not tone deaf. It's just a matter of training. It's just a matter of finding it. But if we're talking about community, if we're talking about narrative reality, there is nothing so powerful as music. Because when you sing in a choir, you are communicating in ways that are not rational. Because each single, I'll illustrate this with an example. So recently, I was commissioned to do a recording for a choir of a piece of music in Church Slavonic, which is the language used in church services in the Russian church. And I was commissioned to do two of the four voices, because in men's choir you usually have four voices singing together. And so I have a high voice. I was singing first and second tenor, and I recorded those tracks separately. And then someone took those tracks and wove them together through a computer program with one other person who sang the third and the fourth voice. And although this person was able to combine the voices as individually recorded into a piece of music that was technically sung accurately, it did not sound like music. It sounded like a computer program. And it would never play on any radio station. It would never be listened to for pleasure. It was merely a tool for people to learn the notes. So for what it was fine. Because what happens when you are in person, in communion with another human being who is next to you, is that you harmonize your vowels, your intonation, the sound you make, the quality of the sound, the taste of the sound, in ways that defy your logical mind. You don't think about it. It happens. And the more you sing together, the more it happens. So much so that what ends up happening, in particular in my choir, I've been conducting it for almost 10 years now. And we have people cycling in and out all the time. It's a seminary. We have young men coming in and leaving. The longest anyone's ever stayed is 5-6 years maximum. The sound we have is consistent. It's sound. You can immediately hear that this is the choir of this monastery, because there is a spirit to it that is determined by the conductor, that is determined by the approach that I take to the music, that is also determined by the approach that the singers have to the music and the seriousness with which they approach both the word and the music. And what happens is a harmony of body, mind, spirit, soul, everything in a single package, that if you are there present in the middle of it, has the capacity of moving you in ways that almost nothing does. It is a truly amazing experience. This is why people are hanker so much for live concert experiences right now. And that's the thing that's going to explode as soon as people are allowed to go back out. Music is going to be one of the first things people go to, because this is the thing that they miss. Because there's only so much you can do with this. You can have technical brilliance and beauty, but you cannot be inside the sound unless you are in the physical presence of people making music.
Wow. Yeah. And that the fellowship that we long for in this Corona time, I think, and how this is an opportunity for us to realize, like, we have a culture that promotes the individual and all the individual needs, and the kind of it, which is separating us more and more and more into our own little silos of, like, Netflix is our direct connection to the heavens, basically.
Yes.
But what really nourishes us is to be a part of something that's bigger than us. And being lost in that, being able to dive fully into that as well, right? And
without, however, losing your voice as part of the whole. So it's not simply being absorbed into a large nirvana or non-reality. It is simultaneously individual and communal. Something that is very difficult but very beautiful when it happens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I'll drop the name Saint Maximus. I'm busy trying to research right now, writing an article about exactly this topic of unity and diversity, which is a challenge we have working with men of very different persuasions and backgrounds as well. And how do we maintain that space for, being yourself apart from all others? So singing
can be done.
Something I think we need to do some more singing. So if you ever feel like coming to Denmark and leading a course at the European Men's Gathering, then we'd love to have you here.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, Nicholas, thank you so much for talking to me today and sharing. I want to highly recommend, if people want to hear you more, my go-to place would be In a Certain Kingdom podcast. I think it's great. I'll put the link into the description for this video. And have a great week. Thanks.
Yeah, you too. This was a real pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks.